Thank you everyone for joining. My name's Rufus Lacey. I'm a housing advisor at the University of London Housing Services. This session is on understanding tenancy agreements, and it's part of a series of webinars that we're holding during the course of this housing week around your rights as a tenant and, you know, helping you out with your hunt for housing. I'll just start off with a bit about us as a service. So who are ULHS, University of London Housing Services? So we offer free advice to students from our member institutions, primarily in the private, advice to students who are living in the private rented sector. This can range from advice on issues with landlords and agents, disrepair, advice around deposits, anything really housing related. We can offer advice by appointment. I'll leave our contact details at the end of this webinar, so if you do need any help from us, please do feel free to get in touch with us. We offer a contract checking service. So, I mean, this session is obviously around tenancy agreements. But if you're looking at signing a contract over this summer and you're uncertain about anything, please do get in touch with us. What we can do is have a chat with you, an hour-long contract checking session where we'll go through your contract with you. We'll make sure it all looks okay. We'll make sure you understand it, and we'll make sure it's fair and everything looks good and above the law. And we'll answer any questions that you may have about the contract. We produce publications, primarily our private housing guide, which is a really useful guide for navigating your way through the sort of English rental system. There's loads of useful hints and tips. I'd strongly recommend you have a look on our website and download a copy of that. We do events such as this Housing Week, the Housing Fair, which is this Thursday. So a chance for you to speak to landlords and letting agents and hall providers and get an idea of your options for the academic year to come. We have a flatmate finder event, actually one of which has just happened in the last hour, giving you an opportunity to meet new potential flatmates. And then we hold webinars and talks such as this one throughout the year. And then we have an online property platform where we advertise properties to students, or landlords advertise through us. There are many ways you can find private housing in London. One of the assurances that we're able to give students is any property that's advertised through us, we do more checks than a lot of other rental websites. Again, it's completely free for you to register with us, but we do checks around the ownership of the property and make sure that landlords have the right kind of documents that are required by English legislation. So let's move on to the session itself. So what is a tenancy agreement? It's a legally binding contract between you and your landlord. So once you sign this and the landlord signs it, it's held by law. So any agreements that are within it are legally binding from the point of signature. It's kind of the terms and conditions of your year or your period living in a property. A tenancy agreement is the most common type of contract you'll see in the private rented sector. It's called an assured short hold tenancy. That's the legal term for it. It should be pretty clear to you if you're signing an assured short hold tenancy. Usually it'll be titled by that name. If you're unsure at all, if you don't see a short hold tenancy on the document, if it makes any reference to the resident as being a tenant, then you can be pretty sure that you are a tenant, and it's an AST, a short hold tenancy. An AST offers you legal protections. Now, these are things that you're covered by law. So regardless of what's in the contract itself, the law, English law, allows you certain protections that can't be overridden by a contract. I should say, sorry, just you'll have a Q&A button, and if you do have any have any questions during the session, please do just put your questions in the Q&A. I'll try and get through them at the end of the session. One question that has come in, is this session being recorded? And yes, it is. It will be available during the housing fair on Thursday. I'll just carry on. So some of the rights that you'll have as a tenant, again, as I say, regardless of what the contract itself says, this is legal rights that you have. You'll have exclusive occupation of the property that you're signing for. So what this means is the landlord is signing over possession of the property to you. So once you've moved in, the landlord can't disturb you. He can't turn up unannounced, wanting to come into the property. He should give you proper notice, he or she, I should say. So the property is being handed over to you for the period that you're agreeing to, whether it's 12 months, 6 months, or 2 years, whatever it is. You have the right to deposit protection. So you'll be paying, most commonly, you'll be paying a security deposit of up to 5 weeks rent for prior to moving in. This is to cover, things like damages during the course of the tenancy. This deposit should be protected with a government approved scheme. We are holding a webinar tomorrow on deposit protection and deposits generally. So if you don't know about anything about deposit protection, I'd recommend that you attend tomorrow's webinar. You have security of tenure and protection from eviction. So if you'll most commonly you'll be signing up to a fixed term, a fixed period of time that you'll be living at the property. And during that period, you have security of tenure. So what this means is if the landlord wants you to leave during this agreed term, he would normally need to give you, go to court basically to evict you. At the end of the fixed term, you have legal rights around the notice periods. So normally, outside of a pandemic, the notice period for ending a short hold tenancy is 2 months. Currently, under sort of the pandemic that we're living under, that has been extended to 4 months. So at the end of the fixed term, you should expect a minimum of 4 months notice. There are some exceptions to this, such as if you don't pay your rent, and if the rent arrears accrues, landlords can try to get possession of the property a bit earlier, but again, that would be a court process for them to do that. You also have legal protection around repairs. So the landlord has a duty to keep the property in good condition for the duration of the property. Sorry, duration of your stay at the property. So if there's anything that needs fixing during the course of the tenancy, specifically relating to the build and the structure of the property, then the landlord has a responsibility to keep those things in good working order and to repair things that do fall into disrepair. So as a tenant, you also have obligations. Normally these would be stated in the tenancy agreement. The first obligation that you'll have is to pay the rent. So your contract should say how much and at what points you should pay the rent. Normally it would be monthly. Sometimes for overseas students, it can be paid in advance, so in 6 months installments. This should be very clear though from the should be made very clear from the contract though, whether you're paying monthly or in larger installments. Usually on the first or the second page of the contract, it should be quite clear for you to see. So you have an obligation to keep the property in good condition, to just generally look after the property. You will pay a deposit at the start of the tenancy, and if things get broken, through sort of negligence or misuse, your money can be taken out of your deposit at the end of the tenancy. So, you just it's important to pay attention to the tenant's responsibilities in terms of keeping the property in good condition. The tenant has an obligation to report repairs to the landlord. So a landlord can't carry out a repair without being told about it. So your only duty when it comes to repair is to let the landlord know, basically. And once you've let the landlord know, it is their duty to carry out those repairs within reasonable time. And reasonable time really does depend on the nature of the job, or how urgent it is, I should say. So if your boiler breaks down in the middle of winter, that's an urgent job, and I would normally expect that to be addressed within 24 to 48 hours. It's the tenant's responsibility to take care of the more day-to-day maintenance obligations, and this prime example of this is replacing light bulbs and batteries for smoke detectors. I would expect them to be all in good working order at the start of the tenancy when it's handed over to you, but once you start living there, it is your duty to keep those things in good repair, or to replace those items, I should say. It's your duty not to cause damage or nuisance. So, willful damage, kicking holes in walls, breaking windows, those kind of things. When I say nuisance, I mean, late night parties, those kind of things that would cause antisocial behavior, that would be deemed as antisocial behavior. There is an obligation for you to sort of minimize those things at least. And the underlying principle of all of these is to treat the property in a tenant-like manner. Now, tenant-like manner is kind of the legal term for treating a property as if it were your own home. So to live in it and to respect the property as you would, your own home that you live in. I'm just going to have a look at the Q&A quickly, just to see if there's anything to address. So one question is, someone's experience is it an unwritten common conduct for the landlord to take some of the deposit no matter what, even if there's no damage, sometimes of up to £100? May I know if this is true? Basically, no, that shouldn't happen. The landlord should not be taking your deposit without very good reason. So at the end of the tenancy, if the landlord is proposing to take any money from your deposit, then it should be made absolutely clear what that deduction is for. And it can only cover things like damages to the property, unpaid rent or bills. The landlord can't just say, I'm taking this because I want it. That's not fair, and it's not right, and that's why we have deposit protection in the UK. Deposit protection prevents exactly that from happening. There are schemes that the deposit must be registered with, and if there are any disputes between the landlord and the tenant at the end of the tenancy over any deductions that are made, it can be referred to the scheme, and they will make sure that you get the right amount of money back. Basically, they'll make a decision based on evidence that you provide and the landlord provides. So if the landlord doesn't have evidence for any deductions, then he's not going to be able to make those deductions. The scheme won't rule in their favour. How much? Another question is how much deposit shall be paid normally. So I will come on to that briefly. As I say, there is a webinar specifically on deposits tomorrow, but a security deposit can't be any more than 5 weeks worth of rent. So there's a very clear cap to how much deposit you can actually be charged. So anything over 5 weeks worth of rent is prohibited. So the landlord's not allowed to take, by law, that much money. One more question, is house cleaning a valid reason to take deposits? So it's your responsibility to return the property in the same condition as it was when you moved in. So if the property was professionally cleaned before you move in, there will be an expectation for it to be cleaned to a professional level when you move out. If the property is dirty and not clean when you first move in, then again, your responsibility is to return it in the same condition. So it can't be said as standard that you have to, the money for cleaning the property can be taken out of your deposit. It really does depend on the condition at the start, at the outset. And just one more, I'll just answer this last one and then I'll move on. What if the landlord keeps asking you to repair this, repair that? So as I say, it's generally speaking, it's the landlord's duty to carry out repairs on the property. I would actually advise against any tenant from taking on repair jobs themselves, because once you take on the responsibility of repairing, if you don't do a good job, or if someone you employ to do the job doesn't do a good job, you do take on liability for that. So it shouldn't be the landlord asking you to repair this and repair that. It should be the other way around. You make sure that you're putting it back on the landlords, and they're the ones that need to carry out these repairs. Okay, I'll come back to the questions at the end of the slides, but right now I'll move on. There's different types of tenancies that you can actually have depending on the setup of the house. There's joint tenancies and individual tenancies. I'm just going to go through some of the key differences between the two. Just for context though, a joint tenancy will be where a group of students or tenants are living in the same property and all the tenants are named on one contract. Now, just for the purpose of these slides, if you're an individual who is going to be taking on a one-bedroom property, basically a property that only you will live in, and you will have sole access to the bathroom, the kitchen, and basically all the facilities in the house, consider yourself to be under the joint tenancy column here, because you will be all of the tenants on the contract. For the individual tenancy I'm going to talk about, it's going to be in instances where you're living in a shared flat, a shared house, but you have your own tenancy agreement, so only you're named on the contract. I'll come back to that when I go through the individual tenancy though. So with a joint tenancy, all of the tenants living there will be named on the contract and will hold joint liability for the contract. What this means is primarily you'll have joint responsibility for the rent and the deposit of the property. So when I say that, what I mean is, let's say there's 4 of you living in the property. The monthly rent is £2,000 in total. You might each be paying £500 towards the rent. However, it's really important to remember that all of your responsibility is towards that £2,000 in total. So if one of you didn't pay your £500, all of you would be equally liable for that rent. So really important, well, make sure you trust everyone that you're living with and you have a good understanding with them, because you will be taking on joint responsibility for everyone's financials, basically. And that includes the bills as well. So assuming that bills aren't included in the rent, and again, this should normally be quite clear from the contract whether they are or they aren't. But if bills are not included in the rent, then you will also have joint responsibility for the bills. So you'll need to make arrangements as a group to make sure you're all paying your bills. And if one person doesn't, then you will all take responsibility for that owed money. So as a joint tenant, you'll have exclusive possession of the whole property. So you'll have complete possession of the whole, let's say it's a house, you'll have complete possession of that whole house, including the shared living areas, such as the kitchen, bathroom, living room. If there's a garden in the property that you have sole access to, when I say you, I mean the joint tenants have sole access to, you'll also have exclusive possession of that. So what that means is the landlord, as I say, they can't turn up wanting to view the property or even do repairs without giving you notice first. If they turn up without notice, then you have the right to turn them away and ask them to make an appointment. You'll have joint responsibility for the condition of the property as well. So again, although there may be 2, 3, 4 of you living in the property and you'll all have your own bedrooms, if one of you makes a particularly bad mess of your own bedroom at the end of the tenancy and doesn't tidy it up, all of your deposit can be deducted, you know, for any damages that need to be repaired. So you have joint responsibility for the condition of the whole property. So you need to work together on keeping it in good condition, basically. One of the main perks of a joint tenancy is that you have complete control over who you're living with. So at the start of the tenancy, it's most common for, you know, groups of friends to be living on a joint tenancy. So the group will approach the landlord or the agent, you know, looking for a property, and, you know, be put onto a joint tenancy. So you'll have control over who you're living with, and during the course of that fixed term, the same people should live in the property for the duration. So moving on to an individual tenancy agreement. As I say, this, you might be living with other people in a shared house or a shared flat, but the landlord might want to give individual contracts to each person in the property. So if you're have an individual tenancy, only you will be named as the tenant on the contract. Again, it should be very clear in the first couple of pages of the contract whether it's joint or individual. Basically, if more than one tenant is named, then it's a joint tenancy. If one tenant is named, it's an individual tenancy. As an individual tenant, you'll only be responsible for your own rent and deposit. So you don't have to worry about other people living there, whether they're paying their rent or not. You're only responsible for your contracted amount of rent and deposit. So, and nothing can really affect that. You may have joint responsibility for the bills, but you do need to check the contract. It's probably more common in a shared flat with individual contracts that the landlord will pay for the bills or include it into the rent. But it is worth just being clear on that from the outset, because you're not on the same contract, or you may not know the other people that you're living with. It can be a bit more difficult to sort out the bills. Normally, the landlord will kind of coordinate that, but I suppose you never know who's using what. So just check the contract around that. In an individual tenancy, well, in a joint tenancy, I mentioned you have exclusive possession of the whole property. With an individual tenancy, you have exclusive possession of your room, the room that you're contracted to. But you probably won't have exclusive possession of the shared spaces, such as the kitchen, living room, and bathroom. What this means is the landlord is free to enter the property, the shared spaces, without giving notice, whereas they'll still need to give notice to enter your room though. This can be one of the main drawbacks of an individual tenancy. You just don't have quite the same control of the property. With an individual tenancy, you're responsible for the cleanliness and the condition of your own room, but not so much the shared spaces. So again, thinking of the deposit, at the end of the tenancy, you need to, you know, make sure you take good care and you know, return your room to the same condition as it was when you moved in. But the shared spaces, not so. So, you know, that can be another perk of an individual tenancy. One of the drawbacks, though, of an individual tenancy is that you don't have the same control over who you're living with. So flatmates might come and go while you're living there. If you don't get on with one of the flatmates, it's there's not really a lot you can do. You really don't have much choice in who you're living with, because you are all on individual contracts. They may not all start and end at the same time. So you'll have a lot less control around who's actually living in the property. So some things to look out for in your agreement, in your tenancy agreement. So most tenant fees are banned. There's something called the Tenant Fees Act in England. It basically prohibits landlords and agents from charging many of the fees that used to be charged to tenants. So prior to moving into a property, you shouldn't expect to pay anything more than a holding deposit just to secure the property. Once you've sort of declared an interest in it, that can only be up to 1 week's worth of rent. The security deposit, which, as I say, is for sort of damages and unpaid bills, that can only be up to 5 weeks of rent. And then the rent itself, there shouldn't be any other fees that you should have to pay prior to moving in. During the course of the tenancy, there are very little fees that a landlord can charge as well. When I look at contracts, one of the first things I often look at is I scan through to see whether there are any costs in there, any fees that the landlord is trying to impose on the tenant, because generally speaking, they're not allowed. So admin fees aren't allowed. The landlord can't charge you for drawing up an inventory or a schedule of condition. Cleaning fees, they can't have a flat cleaning fee that they charge everyone. There are a couple of small exceptions, things like interest for late payment of rent. Landlords can charge that, but that's capped at 3% of the above the Bank of England's base rate. Also, replacement keys. If you lose keys, the landlord can charge you the real cost of replacement keys. Outside of that, there's very little that they can really charge you. When you receive a copy of your contract, and before you sign it, most importantly, just check all the details and make sure they're all correct, and any agreements are in the contract. So make sure the agreed rent is, what it should be. All the dates are correct. The deposit is correct. And any individually negotiated clauses or agreements, such as provision of furniture, or professional clean before you move in, I would expect generally to see them in the contract. Once you sign the contract, as I say, it's legally binding. So if there are any mistakes, like the rent is too high, you are actually legally bound to that. So be very careful around that. Look out for unfair contract terms, and what this means is it's contract terms that place an imbalance on you, the tenant, so that favour the landlord. So, for example, a term that allows the landlord to end the tenancy at the halfway point, but doesn't allow you to do the same, would be deemed an unfair contract term, and it can't be relied upon. Basically, it would be unenforceable. So the landlord wouldn't be able to rely on that to end the tenancy. They can't bypass their legal obligations by putting unfair contract terms into the contract. You might want to look out for break clauses. So break clauses aren't in contracts as standard. They're usually individually negotiated. And what a break clause is it's a clause that allows you to end the contract early. Normally they go both ways. So the landlord can give notice and the tenant can give notice at a set point or after a set point. Usually if on a 12-month contract, quite commonly it's after 6 months. So they can be quite handy, because contracts are very rigid, and if there's no break clause, you are bound to pay the rent for the entire duration of the agreed term of the contract. What a break clause can do is, if your circumstances change, it can allow you to get out of the contract before the agreed end date upon giving notice. Now, as I say, they can work both ways. So it does also mean after that fixed point, the landlord can also give you notice to end the tenancy. However, as long as you're paying the rent, that doesn't happen so often. So if normally you would need to negotiate to have a break clause inserted into a contract. They're actually particularly useful currently, when you've got a pandemic going on and there's a lot of uncertainty about study or there has been for the last year, and who knows for the next year. So it can be quite handy to have a break clause in the contract. And then I'd really strongly recommend that, you know, if you're uncertain about anything, to come and see us and get your contract checked. We will, you know, talk you through any uncertainty you do have. We'll be able to notify you of any red flags, anything that we see that doesn't look right. So don't sign your contract until you're absolutely sure that you're happy with it. And I would strongly advise you you have it checked through by a professional. Um, yeah. So there is another kind of contract that you might come across in the rented sector, and these are called license agreements. Now, they're probably most commonly you'll see them in if you're living in student halls through your university. So you know, if you gain accommodation directly from your university, you might have a license agreement. Another common time that you might see a license agreement is if you're living in the landlord's house. So you're sharing with the landlord. So as a lodger, they're renting out a room in their house to you. So a license agreement offers you less legal rights. So you don't have the same right to exclusive occupation of the property. So the landlord can enter the property much easier. There's no requirement to protect a deposit. You know, you might still be paying a deposit, but it doesn't necessarily have to be protected with one of the government schemes. Notice periods can be different. So under a license agreement, the landlord has, and the tenant as well, can give reasonable notice to quit the contract. So there might still be a fixed term, but reasonable notice can be given to end that fixed term. And that's if you're paying rent monthly, usually reasonable notice would be deemed the same as the rental period, so 1 month's notice. And you also have less protection from eviction. So you don't, although um, you know, you can't necessarily be evicted from the property without a court order. There's a lot less restrictions around allowing an eviction to take place under a license agreement. It's always worth, well, beware of sham license agreements. What that means is that's when a license agreement should be a tenancy agreement. So if you're renting in the private rented sector and you know you're not living with the landlord, it's not through the university, generally speaking, it should be an assured short-hold tenancy. However, there are some I suppose unscrupulous agents and landlords who might try to give a license agreement as a way of restricting your rights, so that they don't have to protect your deposit and they can, you know, come and go into the property as they please. Now, again, it should be pretty clear whether this is a license or a tenancy agreement. Any reference to tenant in the contract should mean that it's a tenancy agreement. If instead of referring to the person living there as a tenant, if instead it calls you a resident or a licensee, then that means you are a licensee and it's a license agreement. If it is a sham license agreement, there are arguments that just because it says it's a license, it doesn't mean it is a license, and it can still be argued that there is a tenancy in place. Again, if you have any concerns about this, what I would say, I don't want to get into too much depth about it now, but please do get in contact with us. If you're unsure about anything, just let us know. That's it in terms of the slides. So thanks for attending. I'm just going to have a look at and see if there are any more questions in the Q&A. If you do have any questions, just type them into the Q&A now, and I'll try and get through as many as I can. So let's have a look. Sorry, so one question is, there's three main things that you may expect prior to moving in: the holding deposit, the security deposit, and the one that you've missed there is the rent. So basically, it's the first instalment of the rent would be the third thing that you'd expect to pay at the start prior to moving in. Hope that answers the question. So someone else has asked, did you mention that 1 week fee was allowed for something in a tenancy agreement? If so, what is that allowed? So 1 week's worth of rent is allowed to be charged for a holding deposit. A holding deposit is it's a fee for securing a deposit. So once you've viewed a property and you think you like it and you think you have intentions to go ahead with it, the agent might or the landlord might ask for a holding deposit, which is like a retainer basically. It's like you confirming your commitment to the property. If the tenancy goes ahead, that 1 week's worth of rent should be included in the rent, so you should get it back in that sense. If you pull out of the tenancy though, the landlord or the agent will be allowed to keep that, you know. If the landlord or the agent pulls out of the tenancy before it starts, then you should get that 1 week holding deposit back. Hope that's clear. So another question, what if we planned on coming with other people, but they dropped out at the last minute? That all depends on whether the contract is signed or not. So if it's not been signed, then you can find a replacement, you know, and have that new person added to the contract. If someone drops out at the last minute but the contract has all been signed by both the tenants and the landlords, well, the person who's dropped out is still going to be liable for that contract, and so will all of the tenants. What can be done in instances where someone drops out, whether it's before or after the tenancy has started, you can find a replacement tenant. So someone to take over that person on the contract. You do need to get permission from the landlord to do that. But, you know, that's a circumstance, again, have a look at our housing guide and come and speak to us for advice if that was to happen. Someone else has asked, is a tenancy safer than a license? I mean, generally speaking, yes, because it gives you more legal protection around protection from eviction. It means your deposit is being kept safe. So yes, generally speaking, a tenancy agreement is safer. Someone has asked for the slides before the license agreement to be shown again. I can just get that up now. I'm hoping this is the one you mean. I'll just leave that up on the screen for the moment. How do we use your contract checking service? So you can make an appointment with us. So you can either email us at housing@london.ac.uk and just ask us for a contract checking appointment, or you can give us a call. Sorry, the phone number's not on the screen anymore, but you can give us a call and we'll book you in for an appointment, and you should send us a copy of the contract beforehand so that we can go through the contract with you. But we'll take you through your contract. We'll check the ownership of the property to make sure the landlord is who they say they are. And we'll go through the terms of the contract with you and answer any questions that you have. And that's normally a 1 hour session. So if you're international students but under the UCL RGS, will we be expected to pay 6 months rent up front? It's not uncommon, to be honest with you. If you don't have a I'm assuming you mean if you're under the UCL guarantor scheme. I would say no. If you have a guarantor, basically, I wouldn't expect you to have to pay advanced rent, so larger installments of rent up front. If you have no guarantor, then it is quite common to have to pay up to 6 months rent up front. I would generally advise though, if you are an overseas student and you don't have a guarantor, don't pay anything more than 6 months worth of rent on a year contract. just for your own sort of safekeeping, it's a large instalment to pay more than 6 months. So I would generally try to avoid that. So for international students who have been studying remotely, we have yet to enter the UK and have not collected our BRP. Will this pose a problem when finding accommodation? So the landlord must complete right to rent checks within 28 days of the tenancy starting. So they'll have to verify your identity and your right to residency 28 days before the tenancy starts. So, I mean, obviously, you might not be in the country yet, so that might not be possible. So basically, once you enter the country, those checks will take place. If the tenancy can't go ahead for any reason, because there's a risk of failing the right to rent checks, I would basically strongly advise you speak to the landlords as early as possible, and also get some advice from your student services. And you can also come and see us if it affects the tenancy itself. It's a bit of a complicated one to give us a simple answer to, though, that one. I'll take a few more questions. So someone signed a contract, but when you moved in, many of the appliances were broken. What should I do? Basically, you should get onto your landlord about that. So there's a clause in your contract that you should look out for. So when I say the landlord has legal responsibility to keep the property in good repair, that's for the build and the structure of the property. So for the structure of the property itself. Now, in terms of the appliances in the property, normally there'd be a separate clause in the landlord's responsibilities around that. It's not necessarily, there's no legal responsibility for this, but look out for it. Basically, it'll cover the appliances and the electrical items, such as the white goods, the fridge, the oven, etc. If you have any problems, though, with the condition of the property upon move-in, well, one thing is you should come and see us, and we can give you some detailed advice around that. If you're dealing with a letting agent, you can make a complaint to the agent themselves. They should all have very sort of robust complaints procedures. But I would say book an appointment with us, and I'll just leave the contact details back up, and we'll take you through, because that's quite a unique thing to the situation, to your own situation. So we'll be happy to have a chat with you about that. So someone asking about VAT to the price. I'm assuming you mean adding VAT to the rent. So it should be quite clear what you're paying. So that shouldn't be charged to your rent. Hope that answers. So there's a couple of questions here that are related to sort of quite personal circumstances. As I say, what I would really strongly advise is that you get in contact with us directly and book in for an appointment. They're not physical appointments, so they're over the phone. So wherever you are, we can set an appointment with you, and a housing advisor will take you through, and make sure they'll support you also with ongoing support outside of the appointment itself, if need be, and can help you to negotiate with your landlord or letting agent. So if you have any problem with sort of the cleanliness of the property or the repair of the property when you're first moving in, do get in touch with us, and we'll book you in for an appointment, for an advice appointment. So someone's asked, what can I do if the landlord or agent asks for an unfair deposit? or if they make an unfair contract. Who can I speak to? Well, as I say, you can speak to us. If the landlord asks for a deposit, let's say that's over the capped amount, the 5 weeks worth of rent, well, they're breaking the law, so you can report them to the local authority, trading standards, who can prosecute the agent or the landlord. There are other various courses of redress that you can take. You can make an appointment with us, and we can write to the landlord and ask that they return any prohibited amounts that they've taken from you. Someone else just asking about advanced rent. Is it true that you'd have to pay 6 months rent up front? As I say, if you don't have a guarantor, then normally, well, quite often you will need to pay advanced rent, and quite often that is 6 months worth of rent being paid up front. But again, it's all the more reason to make sure that you're happy with the contract that you're signing prior to signing it and getting it checked. And as I say, we can help you with that. So someone's asked, would you suggest students enter into joint or individual contracts? What's more common with undergrad? To be honest with you, it's very difficult for me to say, because it really does depend on your personal circumstances. If you have a group of people that you're planning on living with, I would probably suggest that you go on a joint tenancy, just because you have more control of the property. You also, you get that exclusive occupation, so you know that no one else will be moved into the property while you're living there. But I suppose an individual contract is a little bit more flexible, in the sense that, well, you don't have to rely on other people, but you don't have that same control over the property itself. So it really does depend on your own personal circumstances. Someone else has asked, does the security deposit go towards the rent? No, it doesn't. It's held by the landlord for the duration of the tenancy. So assuming there's no disputes or there's no deductions at the end of the tenancy, you should get it back in full once the tenancy ends. And as I say, there's fair processes in place just in case there are any disputes around the deposit. And please do attend tomorrow's webinar on deposits if you have any questions, or if you're unsure about around tenancy deposits. Someone else has asked, is contract checking from ULHS only for houses that are found through our own services? No, we'll check anyone's contract. It doesn't matter where you found the property. We can check your contract with you for you, regardless of where you source the property from. Someone else has asked, how much time do I have to check the contract before I sign? Well, the landlord shouldn't put undue pressure on you. I would expect them to give you at least 48 hours to have a look through the contract. If they are pressuring you, I would seriously consider whether you want to go ahead. It's a really important commitment that you're making, so it really is important that you understand what you're signing. So, but I would generally say good practice would be that you should be given around 48 hours at least to check your contract or have your contract checked. Someone else asking what a break clause normally looks like. I mean, normally they will say when they can be enforced. So let's say it's a 6-month break clause. It'll give the exact dates that you can serve the notice on. So it may say that you can serve 2 months notice after 4 months, giving notice for 6 months. And normally there will be 2 separate clauses, one for the landlord and one for the tenant, but they should look identical. There's a lot of questions coming in, so I'll keep going through a few more. So someone's asked how much an agent should charge for their services relative to the rent. Well, an agent shouldn't charge anything for their services. They might charge service to the landlord for as a commission for finding tenants in a property, but they shouldn't be charging you anything at all for finding finding a property for you. And they're not actually allowed to. So, you know, if they are, then they're breaking the law. Is it the responsibility of the tenant to pay council tax? This is a bit of a complicated area, but basically, if you're a full-time student, you should be exempt from paying council tax. So you will still need to submit your exemption certificate that you'll get from your university to the council, to the local authority, and that will prevent you from getting any nasty bills during the course of the tenancy. If you're a part-time student, you may have some liability to pay the council tax. I would suggest you have a look at our private housing guide on our website for a bit more information around this. It can be a bit of a complicated area, but you will find information about council tax on our housing guide, which you can find on our website. So someone else has asked, do we pay council fees other than council tax? If you are eligible to pay council tax, no, you shouldn't have to pay any council fees. Does the guarantor have to live in London, the UK? So they don't have to live in London, but generally speaking, they would have to be UK based. And the reason for this is that if you're going to have a guarantor, the agent or the landlord is going to want them to be based in the UK because if they're going to need to pursue any rent from the guarantor, well, they'll want them to be within the UK laws and jurisdictions. If someone's overseas, it's very hard to pursue money legally. So generally speaking, if you are asked to provide a guarantor, they will need to be UK based. Okay, someone else has asked about a fee, a clause in their contract, which is, let me just read the question. In short, I have not transferred my remaining rent fees, but there is a clause that writes 3% fees, which will be charged if the rent is overdue. I could argue that the property has severe damage, so can I withhold the rent fees? I would generally speaking always advise against withholding rent payments because you are legally obliged to pay the rent, and although the landlord might not be doing something right, you can't really cancel that out by not paying your rent. It's important that you do the things that the contract asks you to do, and you know, take the right procedures over taking action against the landlords who isn't doing the things that they should be doing. So as I say, come and see us for advice around that. I'll just take one or two more questions because we are overrunning a little bit. So is the holding deposit retained similarly to the security deposit? As I say, no, the holding deposit shouldn't be retained. If you pay a holding deposit, that 1 week's worth of rent, when you agree the property, sign the contract and pay your security deposit and your first instalment of rent, that holding deposit should be a deduction from that installment of rent. So it shouldn't be taken as a fee. It should be absorbed into the rent, the first installment of rent that you pay. So what's involved in the right to rent check and how long does it take? It shouldn't take too long. So the landlord needs to take a copy of your visa documents or passport, basically your your proof documents that prove you have the right of residency in the UK. They might also ask to see your university letter just confirming that you are a student. Again, there's a lot of information around this in our private housing guide. So I'm going to say this is the last question I'll take here. So can UL be guarantor if we've never lived in uni housing. I don't know if you mean University of London there or UCL. I would speak to the UCL guarantor scheme if you do mean UCL. There are certain sort of terms and conditions that to allow you to be eligible for their scheme. University of London ourselves, we don't act as guarantor for tenancies. And on that, I think I'll call an end to this session. Thanks all for attending. There were some really great questions there as well, and I hope you found this session useful. As I say, there are webinars taking place all throughout the week. I would really strongly advise you to attend as many as possible. And there's our housing fair as well, which you know, should be really useful way of making contact with agents and landlords, and you know, exploring some of your housing options. So I'll stop there. Thank you all for attending.